We also want to talk about a current commit, Peyton Bowen, because there's obviously, look, the reality is Notre Dame fans are going to be worried about him until signing day. And I don't even chalk that up to BK PTSD. I don't. I get it.
No.
I mean, the kid's made multiple visits, and there was rumors about him taking official visits this summer, which never came to fruition, and they were never serious. At least, especially the one to Michigan, that was all clickbait propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, he still is talking to other schools. Now, Ryan, what I want to dive into is kind of give a little insight as to why we are not as worried about him, because on the surface, this looks a lot like what happened last year with Maureen Walker. And last summer with Maureen Walker, I kept saying time and time again, I don't care what this kid says to Notre Dame, this kid is not going to sign with Notre Dame. And he did. The circumstances are a little different, and obviously every circumstance is different. So we wanted to share with you guys a little bit as to why we're so confident, at least, for now. I mean, if we see the same thing in the fall, he makes 2 trips to see Oklahoma. If he goes to the Texas A&M barbecue or whatever the thing they're doing, is like a pool party or some nonsense.
Yeah.
If he goes to that at the end of July, okay, at that point in time. But from what we've been told, that's not what he plans to do. But we'll see how it plays out, right? But Ryan, I just wanted to give you a chance, and then if I may follow up afterwards, just to kind of tell people kind of your conversation with Peyton, with his mom, with our other sources of why we're just at this point in time, despite understandable angst. Again, we're not ripping you off for the angst because we read the same articles. We know how this goes. Just to give an insight into why, in this particular case, we're not as concerned about it as maybe we should be based on how things look from the outside.
Look, I mean, to be completely honest, me and Brian have talked in the past about the same things that you all are talking about. How locked in is he? What does the actions speak louder than the words? Like all that type of stuff. Like, and it's very understandable to have the talking points. So fans out there and Notre Dame faithful that are talking about Peyton Bowen, it's fine. I get it. I literally have talked about it myself. In this specific case, when the rumblings are still about official visits and going to Texas A&M at the end of the month, and Oklahoma still making a strong push, and Jackson Arnold making a strong push, which is his teammate at Denton Guyer. Like, it's all stuff that is going to make you kind of sit back and be like, is this legitimate? Everybody that I've talked to, and I talked to someone that's closer to the Oklahoma side of everything, they maintain that this is Notre Dame's one to lose. Like,
right.
It would be a massive upset to flip him from Notre Dame at this point.
And I want to reiterate, that's an opinion Ryan is forming from a source he has that's linked to the Oklahoma program.
Right.
I just want to make sure that we're clear on that.
Yep. So if and we know how a lot of media is that's pertinent to a specific team. They're very like, oh yeah, and I think they have a good chance to flip him. It's a very optimistic view, right? I don't think that Oklahoma's in that side is that as optimistic. Texas A&M's an interesting conversation, but either way, right now, I don't think there's too much to worry about. Right. And I think it's also very encouraging that Notre Dame continues to hit home runs in Texas. We talked about up to 4 guys now committed from the state of Texas. And then also, Brian, I mean, in the recent article I wrote, Peyton Bowen is an active recruiter in this 2023 Notre Dame class. And I know there's probably been some examples that you can point to in the past for various programs about guys that were active, but then they flipped. And I'm sure that
but it was always after a period of there was a period where you're like, okay, he's not responding. Like, for example, silent. With Dante Moore, one of the things that we kind of knew that things had soured with Notre Dame was some of the commits we're talking about. I haven't heard from him in a little while. You know what I mean? Like, there's something changes in almost every instance of a kid flipping that was involved with other commits. The way that Peyton Bowen is, there was a period where the commit started to notice this kid doesn't talk as much.
For sure.
And one of the things we talked about is, Drake Bowen and Peyton Bowen were 2 of the big reasons why Christian Gray ultimately picked Notre Dame. It was their relationship with Christian Gray that they built with him, playing games together in the chats, that served a big role to Notre Dame. So again, what he says publicly, in my opinion, is more of a really smart, respectful kid that doesn't want to disrespect programs. And this next part is 100% my opinion. I have no sourcing on this, my opinion. I think that Drake or Peyton also has to be very careful because he has a younger brother that's going through this recruiting process. And with the way that this business is, there are going to be schools that want him that are going to try to mislead his brother or maybe punish his brother. It's a petty business, Ryan. We've seen this before.
Yep.
And so I think that's another delicate line that I think Peyton has to draw. And finding out like who really likes Eli and who really wants Eli because they want to get to Peyton. And I think that's the reason Notre Dame took their time offering Eli, is because they didn't want to offer Eli in the midst of all this stuff of him visiting, because they didn't want it to come across that we're only offering Eli because he's Peyton's brother.
Sure.
From the sources we've talked to, Notre Dame has made it very clear to the family that, look, we want Eli because we want Eli.
Right.
And if, and so I think that's another, and again, that's the part about Peyton is my opinion. The part about Eli and Notre Dame liking Eli, that is intel related.
Sure.
But I think that has to add a lot of pressure to Peyton too. Like, because his brother hasn't made a decision yet. His brother's still open. They're not pushing him to go to Notre Dame. If he chooses to go to Notre Dame, it's because he wants to go to Notre Dame, not because they're pushing him to follow his brother. And so you have to be careful with what you're doing as Peyton, because you want to make sure that you're not doing anything to hurt your brother. Again, that's my opinion, but I think that's something we have to at least consider when you hear what he says publicly with what he says to everyone privately.
Right.
And that's the, that's kind of the thing for me that I look at and say, the conversations that he has with other recruits, the conversations that we hear from sources that his mother has with other parents.
Yep.
All those things, are now, does that mean that he is 100% locked in and committed to Notre Dame and there's no way he flips anywhere else? We're not saying that. Look, because again, as long as a kid, it's one thing for him to say things, but if he goes and visits other places moving forward, that is going to be a cause for concern. So
right.
we're going to be honest about it. If he takes visits in the fall, we'll be more concerned. If he doesn't, then then we'll feel the same way that we do now. So that's where things are at.
Yeah. Well, and I think the last layer that you hit on, Brian, was that I was going to also kind of comment on is the family loves Notre Dame, right? Like his mom is very adamant and very transparent about how much she loves Notre Dame. So I think that he's locked in. I think the family's locked in with the decision. I'm not worried about that at all right now. To your point, though, Peyton is a very respectable young man who is, I think that he's one of those kids that is just he's very thankful for all the schools that have recruited him. So he returns the calls. He returns the texts. He, talks to them. This isn't a point where he's just like, I'm not answering the phone anymore. And that's not necessarily a negative. It's just, it makes you think that things are a little more open than maybe they particularly are. So this is going to be one where you're not going to feel 100% or complete ease until Peyton ultimately does sign with Notre Dame. But for now, like you said, if things change in the fall as far as visits and all that conversation does, I'm going to think a little bit differently. But based upon everything I've heard recently and the interview he also did with Brian Smith, I'm not worried about Peyton Bowen not being in the class right now. Just
right. I think the family part you have to talk about. Somebody brought up like Dante Moore and Maureen Walker. First of all, I said all summer last summer that Notre Dame wasn't going to get Maureen Walker. So they're completely different scenarios. The difference between Dante Moore and in this instance is Moore's family didn't want him to go to Notre Dame. That's a difference between Peyton Bowen. So, and the same thing with the Moore and Walker. So you have to look at every circumstance uniquely and differently. And that's the reality of it. So as long as he continues to, because here's the other thing, somebody else brought up another point too. If his family's going on a trip somewhere with Eli, is he supposed to just stay home?
Exactly.
Right.
It's a great point. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another aspect of it. So we'll see how it goes, but that's kind of that's why we are a now look, as we said at the beginning, we understand why people feel differently. I get it. I mean, I don't chalk that up to BK PTSD. When a kid goes to another campus, that's a concern. Right. And so, and Peyton has visited Alabama since I think his Notre Dame visit, I believe. Didn't he go to Alabama after the Notre Dame visit?
Yeah.
There's talk about him going to this thing or that thing. Those are all legitimate concerns if he follows through with those visits. If he then takes visits in the fall, but even then, it's like, is he taking a visit because of Eli, or is he taking a visit with Eli, or is where he's being recruited? It's a very interesting situation. And at some point in time, these schools are going to have to start saying, okay, if we want Eli, do we then try to recruit Peyton while he's here? Then maybe that hurts us with Eli. It's a very strange situation when you have two brothers that are a year apart.